This is another episode of Mission Ready. Today we're going to talk to a risk management expert. It is Declan Galvin, and I'd really like to hear about Exigent, if you could talk about that today.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me and for the invitation. So Exigent Risk Advisory is a strategic risk advisory business, and we are primarily focused on helping investors and multinational companies operate more confidently in Africa. And the way we do that is through providing geopolitical risk advice. We provide a lot of due diligence and enhanced due diligence support so that people can understand the kind of investments that they want to make. And then, as I always say, we provide investigations for when those investments don't go exactly as they would like. So we're full house investigations, intelligence, and risk advisory.
So, Declan, we see you on international news. What is the interest out there? What's going on?
So I'm really excited about the attention that Africa as a continent is getting, and having focused on policy developments on Africa for such a long time, I think that we're really seeing investors waking up to some of the opportunities and at least being more sober about the problems and those opportunities, rather than just having significant enthusiasm and maybe kind of entering without knowing their left and right. So there's a lot of renewed interest. It's very specific, and I'm seeing more intentionality in engagements with the continent.
And do you see changes in what investors are looking for over time? I mean, what's your experience?
So yeah, that's true. So if we look at the continent as a whole, which I typically advise against, but we are seeing capital markets expand and take hold in certain states. We're seeing more sophistication around supply chains and the movement of products. Whereas if we were talking 15 years ago, this would be about mining, maritime, and agriculture. But we're really seeing a lot of economies shifting, and this is what's generating a lot of enthusiasm.
So of the three that you talked about, what has changed now? Is there new ones?
So there are definitely shifts, right? So I would say across all three of those verticals, ag, maritime, mining, people are much more sophisticated. There's a greater understanding of how to plug into these opportunities, how to build more sustainable two-way partnerships with African governments and communities. And so that's improved, I think, on balance. But we have all these other things which are generating interest, like capital markets, like labor flows, like IT, AI increasingly. And this is something that is going to be driving interest over the next, over the medium and long term.
So we saw in the past lots of mistakes made. Mm-hmm. What could we learn from them? What were the common mistakes from your?
So what I always tell clients is, if we actually distill down what business in Africa looks like, it's no different than any other place in that it's about relationships. It's about having trust building measures in place and growing and deepening these contacts. That is much more significant here. Maybe you can kind of cut corners in other parts of the world, but fundamentally, if you do that, you'll essentially kind of be a runaway train. In Africa, it's much less forgiving if you cut those corners. So it's about building those relationships. It's about being risk aware, understanding kind of what's going on in these places from a political, regulatory, and stability perspective. And if you do that really well, and if you're ready for long-term relationships and engagements, I have all the confidence that people will be successful.
And when you talk about the relationships, is government have a role too in that? A local government, is that the relationships you're talking about? Or are you talking about private relationships?
So I'll take Kenya for as one example. A lot of mistakes that I have seen investors make when they enter the Kenyan market is they say, great, we've met with the ministries, at the national government. We've got really good relationships. We feel like we've got a rhythm going with some of these ministers, and we're ready to roll out this energy project or be involved in water distribution or essential services provision. And what they don't realize is that to be successful in this market, you need to also be engaging and deepening relationships with county governments, and to have a awareness around what's going on at a community level, at a sub-county level. And if you're able to then achieve all three of those things, then you have the level of awareness that you need. Oftentimes investors don't realize that, and they find that there's a lot of expectation gaps between the ministries and the counties, and that becomes a problem for them. Yeah.
But I've also seen that the way international partners like the U.S. invest, it's not government to government as much, but now it's private sector.
Sure.
Does that change things in any way or no?
So same for private sector. I would argue to a certain extent, depending on the government and depending on the project. Let's say a U.S. or a Western government trying to promote business or policy development in if we use Kenya as the example. There's oftentimes a reluctance to go too deep depending on the project. So they wouldn't necessarily be wanting to engage directly with communities because it would make it look like they're circumventing the national government through the agreement arrangements that they have. So this is actually why private sector is essential in the promotion of economic diplomacy on the continent, because businesses can go places and learn things and do things that embassies often are reluctant to or can't do.
So is there practical steps that come to mind for you that investors or entities should think about?
So if you're thinking about entering a market in Africa, so first, in almost all circumstances, don't think of this as an African market. You need to target the locations based off of whatever your criteria are, and begin to scope out that market by doing feasibility studies, due diligence, and people here respect when you come in with thoughtful questions. And if you're not asking those questions, people might question whether you're here for the long haul, and you're going to have a lot of obstacles to overcome. So it's about coming in with intentionality. It's about coming in with thoughtful questions and recognizing that the entire continent's very diverse. And then you're going to be able to kind of learn what you need to do to be successful.
So in East Africa specifically, is there certain investments that come to the top that you think bear closer scrutiny for investment in those things?
Sure. Look, so I think if we think of East Africa and we include Democratic Republic of Congo, which is part of the East African community now, mining and critical resources are going to be at the top of the list. This is what everybody's talking about. And to one extent or another, every one of these countries in East Africa has either critical resource deposits or essential supply chains to take those to market. And those types of investors really need to understand the geopolitical risk that they're facing. They need to understand how that then translates and plays out and impacts local and community-based risk, how that intersects with security problems, community risk, economic planning. That's all really essential for them to get that big picture, and then to make sure that gets dialed in on their specific project and interest.
So Declan, how did you even get involved in this?
So I have always been interested in contemporary African issues, African politics. For my undergrad and graduate degrees, it was focused on Africa. So my master's is African politics. And then I've just focused on the continent. I was an investigative journalist for a while. I always did due diligence work, and then moved into the security space doing intelligence and investigations. Essentially navigating opaque and complex markets and problem sets, trying to find out the ground truth, and then communicate this to decision makers. And so that is what I feel like I've essentially done for all of my career. Try to communicate some of these complex things. And I love it, right? I feel like I've got the best job in the world. I've got my own shop, and get to talk to whoever I want and communicate their knowledge to people who need it.
So how can you get a bachelor's in African politics if it's all local?
Yeah. So exactly. I mean, there's that's of course a misnomer, right? So is there such a thing as African politics, right? This is 2,100 distinct language groups, 54 countries, dozens of political systems, and of course, politics is not static. Community and ideology is not static. So it's a bit of a misnomer. And of course, in the curriculum and in the research you do, you dial in on certain countries or problem sets, despite the broad name.
So going back to risk, okay, when we think about risk over time, has the types of risks changed, or has it always been the same? You always look at it in the same lenses.
So risk has evolved, but what I will say is I am concerned that the risks that we thought we were through in the 80s and 90s are resurfacing, and specifically stability, coups, regional disintegration, interstate conflict, civil war. We really thought that these things were basically done by the mid-2000s.
It's true.
A couple pockets here and there. Of course, Somalia is an issue. DRC has always been an issue. But what we're seeing now is there is a regional war. There is a war in every region of the continent. So you've got Mozambique in Southern Africa. You've got this Rwanda DRC thing, which we hope will be resolved next week. In Central Africa, of course, you've got Somalia. There's a lot of tension still, and it's getting worse in Ethiopia. We've got a civil war in South Sudan. The Sahel is these countries are falling like dominoes. Boko Haram. I mean, the list can go on. And we really thought we were away from this, and it's clear that this is part of our future.
What do you attribute the going back to the 80s?
So I think that if we look at the global financial system, which has disproportionately been led by the U.S., that people living in emerging markets have not felt the social and economic dividends of that system. It is too difficult for people to access credit. Credit's too expensive. Cross-border trade and transactions are still difficult. And yet we are all connected through technology and social share apps, which is allowing us to then consolidate grievance in a way that wouldn't have been possible, 15, 20 years ago. And people are beginning to channel this grievance. They're beginning to mobilize in ways which are non-traditional from kind of how African states have managed this. And so this is why we're seeing so much pushback against a global architecture that has then come down and been localized by ineffective, corrupt, short-sighted governments. And so this is a systematic problem, and I'm not sure collectively what we can do to fix that, other than going piece by piece and saying, okay, this is where we can make some changes. This is where the investment climate is good. It sounds doom and gloom, but there's still tremendous opportunity. And just because there's a war in one part of a country does not mean that the other part of the country is uninvestable.
And I think back in the 80s, was it mostly government to government investments as opposed to private? And now we're moving to private. Will that solve that problem, or will that not work in an unstable situation?
I think that deeper private sector engagement with the external affairs component of dealing with governments and communities, I think this is an excellent antidote to a lot of these problems. Because fundamentally, if we go back to why do we have all these problems across the continent? Well, we have a lot of unemployment, right?
Yes.
Unemployment and underemployment are systematic across the continent. And to go back to the technology component, people hold aspirations which are being unachieved. And this is leading to the consternation and to the Gen Z movements and things like that. If we are able to, as private sector, provide more employment opportunities, good jobs, we have that trickle-down effect, and people are more likely to achieve whatever that is that they're aspiring. So this is a good thing. Going back to the question you asked earlier around, have the opportunities shifted? Well, back in the 80s, it was mining, it was agriculture, it was maritime.
Yes.
And now we've got all sorts of skills-based opportunities. The ICT is a very powerful force. And so people are able to have different kinds of employment outlook. And they're able to do and provide services that wasn't existing in the 80s. So there's a lot of reason to be optimistic on this. We need more investment. We need more employment. And this is what's going to ultimately bring more investors, actually, as these problems become tame.
So, taking it to the Development Finance Corporation that everyone's talking about, it seems like they're focused on de-risking investments for U.S. investments outside the U.S. in a significant way.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think that approach, along with a lot of other policies and approaches coming out of the Trump administration, I think that they're perfect, right? This is really what's needed. So if we go back to critical resources again, the U.S. government correctly has said that critical resources are a national security issue. You can't say something like that and not put your money where your mouth is. And so we can't, and you were hearing this from mining executives all across the world. They're saying, if you don't want us to deal with China, and if this is a national security thing, we need your support, right? And so what we're seeing is the Trump administration is investing, making strategic investments through these vehicles into these companies. They're providing cash. They're providing support. They're de-risking through insurance and guarantees, and that is providing the kind of optimism and confidence for these companies to then pursue these opportunities. And this is exactly what's needed if what we want to do is to compete with China and ultimately remove them from those supply chains. Anything less is too little. And I think we need to be sober about the fact that if this is the national security priority that the United States is saying it is, then we are way behind on the supply chains on most of these critical resources. And most of these critical resources that are hard to reach are in Africa. UK is easy, Australia is easy, South America easier, but the most important ones, the hard to reach ones, are here.
So when I'm in the Beltway, sometimes I hear there's still uninvestable areas like Congo, for example. What's your thoughts on that?
I appreciate that perspective. People have a responsibility to take good care of the people that work in their businesses, to maintain shareholder confidence, to maintain profitability. That's the purpose of businesses. So I appreciate that. I would flip it around and say that it's not that these markets are uninvestable. It's that your risk appetite isn't correctly calibrated to what this need is. And there's lots of things to do to reduce that risk, to induce confidence, in order to kind of pursue these opportunities.
Do you think there's indicators that you would look for that would say some area shifting to a more stable, investable place?
So if we're still talking on the natural resource side, business is taking the signals from the U.S. government and from the Trump administration. This is why this peace deal that is to be signed next week in Washington, D.C. between Rwanda and DRC, that is such a significant moment because that has been U.S. brokered. There's all sorts of side engagements around finding avenues for sustainable investment and ethical investment in these markets. And so that's what people need. People need to know that if they're going to go into higher risk areas, that the U.S. has their back, because Chinese companies know that, right? Yeah. Chinese companies know that if they go in and they're mining coltan, that the Chinese state has got their back, and all the clout that comes from that. And so this government in D.C. putting their money where their mouth is and saying this is a priority and this is what we're going to do to facilitate your success within that is essential.
So what would those side agreements generally be that you can discuss that would stabilize these agreements?
Well, so so what we've got to now go into the diplomacy of what's going on between Rwanda and DRC. So there's actually two concurrent dynamics, processes that are going on. One has been this Washington agreement, which will be signed next week. The second has been a Doha agreement. The Doha agreement is between M23, which is backed by Rwanda, and the Congolese government, whereas Washington's just Rwanda and DRC. out of the Washington Agreement, we're going to have something called accords, right? So there's all sorts of policies and frameworks that are emanating from that agreement, which are going to be implemented in order to commercialize these resources and provide financial inclusion for communities and states. The most important one that's coming out is called REEF, which is the Regional Economic Integration Framework. That it will be, that will be in locations where M23 is currently occupying. And that will be to promote and facilitate the movement of these products with the kind of oversight that's needed so that people are confident that that DRC is and Congolese communities are actually benefiting from this resource rather than just the plunder and extraction, which we've typically characterized with Congo. So that's one example that I'm pretty optimistic on, and where we really need to kind of make sure that there's enough support for that to be successful.
So is that related to when you talk about regulatory uncertainty? These are the types of things to fix that, or is there other issues?
Definitely, right. So this REEF framework, the idea is to introduce regulatory predictability and to not be dealing with all these different governments and different layers of customs and police and military, and to put this into a singular, almost like an economic processing zone, so that investors understand who they're talking to, they understand their obligations, and then they are able to actually forecast their finances and their investment planning to make this a more reasonable investment and decision.
Is there anything that Kenya could learn out of these regulatory certainties that are starting to occur?
Yeah, in many ways, Kenya is leading the charge around some of this market experimentation. I mean, so for example, Kenya launched the continent's first economic zone for services. I mean, services export, right? So it's called Triffic, which is just in Rwanda next to where all the embassies are, and so that is a preferential trade space only for services. So if you are an accounting firm and you set up your headquarters in Kenya, you can go to that, and then you've got all sorts of tax incentives for that export. That's just one example of all these things that Kenya is experimenting with. And I suspect that Kenya is going to really benefit from stability in Eastern Congo and through these regional frameworks. Kenya, I think of all of East Africa's countries, minus Rwanda, they'll be benefiting from that.
When you look at risk generally, is this a very good place to invest, would you say?
It is the returns on the investment can be very good. It takes more time. It takes a lot of intentionality. It takes a lot of risk awareness. But I really don't think that, for me, there's not a lot of choice, right? So you've got a lot of businesses in the United States and Western Europe who recognize that there's a lot of growth in emerging markets, and that they need to find a way to tap into that. And this is East Africa is ideal for those kinds of businesses. But again, they need to be intentional. They need to be risk aware, and they need to know how to build good partnerships.
What's the time horizon typically, and then what do you think is reality
in terms of in terms of when they should move in?
Yeah.
They should be
how long they should be patient on their investments.
Oh, I see. That will be sector specific. It'll be enterprise specific, right? So that's hard for me to calibrate. But in terms of them when to make the move, they should. I think there's no better time than the present. And there is always a first move advantage that comes with additional burden. But I think if they do it right, using those tools that I mentioned earlier, I have all the confidence that they'll be successful.
So getting to specific risks, let's talk a little bit about infrastructure risks, maybe even IT, cyber. Mm-hmm. What's your thoughts on all that?
I think this is an area where the continent is definitely at a 2 and not a 10. We have significant cyber security vulnerabilities, particularly within the financial services space. And some banks do that better. Tier 1 banks, of course, do that best. But most people are not banking with those banks. And so the cybersecurity threat which is both coming from domestic markets as well as from other parts of the world. Russia, in particular, hacked Kenya's e-citizen network maybe 5 years ago and took it down. Those hackers were connected to the Kremlin. That's been proven. Who would have thought, right? Most people wouldn't be thinking that Russia had those interests, but they did. So this is something that really needs to get fixed, and I think that there are still some gaps. This is a good private sector opportunity, right? I think the problem is a lot of banks in this region in particular are scared about admitting they have that problem.
Yes, and
scared about admitting that they don't necessarily know how to fix it because they might not have that know-how. I've spoken with directors of banks and financial institutions, and I've said, where do you rank cyber? And they said, candidly, between us, it's the thing that keeps me up at night. And I understand it. So there needs to be a change in mindset and attitude. People need to admit where they've got those gaps. Otherwise, we can't fix that.
Well, I think we just recently heard Jamie Dimon say that his investments in cyber is unlimited.
Yep.
Because it's a big risk.
Yep.
So what should investors do to mitigate banking risks here, for example?
So I think that a lot of practical stuff, right? So I think the first one is if you're a huge investor, make sure that you're using tier 1 banks, right? The ones that you would already be familiar with, which do operate here. And to be fair to investors, they may not realize that the banks that they would be familiar with have branch offices here, or that they've got strong correspondent relationships. It's essential. The advice that I would provide is manage your cash here the way you would kind of manage it any other place. And just be smart. Don't have everything sitting in a single account with a single administrator. For multinationals, I worry less about this. Where I worry about the cyber threat intersecting with the financial system, it's for successful African businesses who are larger depositors, and the confidence within those systems. If there's a leak that turns out there's been a big ransomware attack, and then we start having Kenyans or African businesses significantly lower their confidence and begin to move their money around, that I get worried about because it has a knock-on effect for other macroeconomic dynamics.
So maybe that leads to the shifting power dynamics among geopolitical. How should Kenya move forward on those things?
So Kenya, we have everything that we need to do to be able to deal with that problem, except for I think there's an attitude issue. And when I say attitude, I mean people are scared to admit that this is a problem and that they're not sure exactly how to do with it. There's resources that they can bring in. There's expertise to fortify this. That's what the other thing Kenya needs to do, candidly, is we still have a big corruption issue here. And in many ways, people want vulnerabilities in systems because they know that there's ways to exploit those vulnerabilities. And so those gaps don't get closed, despite there being the kind of know-how or at least imagination in terms of fixing those gaps. So we've got to deal with the corruption issue. There was a big bank here, maybe this was like 6 months ago, 5 months ago, and they sacked like almost 2,000 employees for misconduct-related activities. And that's just one bank.
When you talk about infrastructure priorities, say in East Africa, what would they be? In your opinion?
Roads are still a thing. Connectivity. There's the ICT component, which obviously we consider critical infrastructure. I think that we also need to find a way to reduce the cost of air travel. It is too expensive to move between countries here, right? I could move between East Coast of the United States and Europe cheaper than I would between Kenya and DRC, right?
Oh, wow.
And we've just got to reduce that cost because that will promote more business. It'll facilitate the movement of goods. That's one of the things that we've got to tackle.
So tell us about risks. Okay, so you talk about general big risks.
Yep.
You identify these risks, but how do you implement them into a day-to-day? Like if a business were to use your services, how would it specifically benefit from that?
Sure. So we come to the client where they are. Now, typically we work with them on strategic issues, but of course they want to know how these things cascade down, and the actual implementation of it becomes easy once you understand the problem set. It's all about decision making, and so that's how we help people implement and operationalize is to scope out whatever that problem set is. If it's political, if it is just operational, right? So like, again, to bring up Eastern DRC, the airport in Goma, which was a very significant node for the movement of goods, that has been closed since January. There's been no air traffic going in there.
Really?
Yeah. So how then do we make sure that goods are getting in there? Well, they're using roads, they're using boats. I was speaking to one retail business that continued to operate despite the M23 invasion, and they got and they have maintained their cold store supply chain, which is amazing. You can go into Bukavu, which is basically cut off from North Kivu. I know most people probably don't know the geography, but it's basically cut off. And I was looking at Irish butter. I saw Kerrygold butter on the shelves. I saw frozen French fries coming from Kenyan businesses. I'm seeing juices from Kenya. In fact, most of the shelves were there. French cheese, South African wine. So there are demands for this kind of stuff. In the case of the cold store supply chains, what they've done is they got boats and they got refrigerators, retail, and they use hooks and elastic bands to anchor those, and then they move the frozen products from one freezer into the other, and then they make the 10-hour journey down Lake Kivu and then offboard them in Bukavu. So this is a really important example of when I say, yes, there's opportunity here. Yeah, those products are more expensive, but there is consumer demand for Irish butter, for starters.
Wow. That's a great commercial for that firm, I think.
Yeah. Kerry Gold's, as the former chairman of the Irish Chamber in Kenya, I can tell you Kerry is an amazing company. They've got a very good presence here in Kenya and Africa. So that's my plug for Kerry.
But you don't represent Kerry.
I don't represent them, but they're a good Irish company.
So to talk about the geopolitical and economic roles and how they're changing, what's your thoughts about this?
So I think if we look at the direction of travel of geopolitics, we are moving to a situation which is far more emphasizing bilateral engagements than multilateral engagements. You have right now the Trump administration is not really interested in multilateral diplomacy or economics. They're very clear about that. China, for its part, is only interested in multilateral dynamics when it benefits China, and they want to undermine anything that has been kind of set up by the U.S. So what we've got is a system in flux with an emphasis on bilateral arrangements, and this, I believe, is the future. When it comes to African states, they're in a great position because they can kind of play both sides, right? They can play the multilateral card when it benefits them. We just had the G20 summit. I think it was earlier this week or last week. The U.S. and China chose not to send people there, right? So this was very much a kind of an emerging market space. But you're going to have, as we're seeing, the U.S. is building bilateral trade agreements with DRC, with Rwanda. I'm really hoping that we'll be able to resurrect some sort of free trade agreement with Kenya. That was a flagship Africa policy for Trump in his first term. Biden shelved it, and I would like to see Trump resurrect that here. And so there's a lot of opportunity. I worry that, and I say this with kindness, I do worry that the diplomatic corps in most African countries is not primed to be able to read the room and then be able to then make policy interventions that takes advantage of this. But businesses, to go back to it, businesses can. Executives of really strong multinational companies in Africa, good African businesses that are looking to get external financing to level up, they read the room. And I think that I think that they're in a position to really take advantage of uncertainty, because in crisis, there's no crisis without opportunity. And that's what I see everywhere in emerging markets is opportunity.
I definitely think you're on something. This morning in the news, you saw that Malaysia and Cambodia signed bilateral trade agreements, and China's protesting aspects of those agreements because they believe it's limiting them.
Yep.
So how will that all play out for, say, a country like Kenya that's dealing with two large entities?
So this is one of the big dilemmas that's going to be playing out. It's going to come into focus next year, but this will be a medium and potentially long-term problem for African states. In the way I've been describing it is what will triumph over states in Africa? Is it going to be U.S. might or Chinese accommodation? Because the Chinese are very accommodating on corruption rules,
Yes,
on flouting labor laws, whatever it takes to kind of cut through the noise and achieve that need. U.S. companies are bound by laws, and so the U.S. government is coming in, and a lot of people will say as a bully, by taking away the carrot and giving more stick. If African countries, maybe Kenya, are not as aligned with their interests as the U.S. administration would want. So this is a dilemma that's going to be playing out across the whole continent. On Kenya, it was about 2 months ago, there was an announcement that Congress was going to review Kenya's status as a strategic non-NATO ally. So at the end of the Biden administration, Kenya was elevated to that status. And because of business dealings between Kenya and Sudan, in a way that the United States is feeling that is countering to their interests, a little bit, but not as much of Kenya's dealings with China in terms of trade. That's kind of a warning shot. I'm optimistic that Kenya's status will remain intact. But that's the kind of thinking that's happening out of DC with regard to Africa.
So, you have regional integration in Africa that's starting to occur, but unfortunately the U.S. is doing bilateral agreements. China is doing multilateral agreements. How you think this will play out, or do you think it's going to result in the bilateral agreements changing to multilateral?
I'm less confident on multilateralism in Africa, right? So we've got the East African community, we have ECOWAS, we have SADC, we have these regional bodies. I don't think that these regional bodies are well positioned to deal with the kinds of problems that we're looking at in the continent, right? So let's take ECOWAS for an example. I was speaking to a contact of mine the other day who went to speak at an ECOWAS kind of security forum, and he said when I walked in and I saw I saw where all the member state flags were of ECOWAS, but there were all these gaps. And he says, at first I thought that they were just being sloppy and they didn't do a good job. And he realized these were the Sahel states who pulled out of ECOWAS. Now, what has ECOWAS been able to do about that? Basically nothing, right? Nothing that's moved the needle, right? In terms of putting these junta regimes under pressure to change their ways. So these multilateral institutions are only as strong as the collective interest. And I think that the priorities of these states are to manage their own internal issues. Right. And ECOWAS or regional bodies may not have as much efficacy in the management of their problems as the rhetoric would suggest. So I think that African states typically think bilaterally. I think that if they play their cards well, this emerging global order is going to be very good for them if they play it well.
So you think bilateral will be the common denominator, the better,
I think so.
Better position?
Yep.
Very interesting.
So much for globalization,
yes.
right? Because when we were in the mid 2000s, you had Friedman and
correct.
But globalization is more of a grind than free flowing, right? And to go back to the comment I made earlier, people in emerging markets do not feel the social and economic dividends of this, and it is creating problems.
So how does this go into currency harmonization and financing? And
so I'll come way out of left field on this next one. So we just put out a risk monitor report, which is our forecast for next year. And one of the trends that we're communicating to the public and to readers is stablecoin has its moment. So stablecoin is a digital asset, a coin that is pegged to the US dollar as a fiat. And there is a lot of opportunity that I'm confident African business owners and economic operators here will receive with more access to stablecoin. Because what we've got now is again, I'll talk about earlier when I was discussing the supply chain in Eastern Congo, despite a militia taking over. You have traders who are buying these products through Uganda, right? And they can either pay in dollars or they have to take francs and then convert them to Ugandan shillings. Dollars are hard to get, although Eastern Congo is a dollar-saturated economy, interestingly enough. So there's all sorts of this foreign currency fluctuation that is maddening for economic operators, right? Dealing with these soft currencies. But for countries which have actual limitations in terms of the access to dollars, if you can just digitize that through a USDT coin, they will take that risk. Because if you look at the cost of lending and borrowing in these markets, you're talking 15-20% interest rate on some of these business loans.
Very good point.
So you can either lose, let's be kind and say 12%. I'll take out a loan, 12% interest rate to be able to cover operational funds, purchase orders, all of that. Or I'll roll the dice on a stable coin, which hasn't failed yet. And then hold some of my currency in that, and then make transitions that feels almost identical to a dollar. Of course, they're going to take that, and so this is very much the future. I'm also going back to the local currency question. You know how you strengthen local currency? Trade in it more. And so we've got to find ways. China's coming in and they're saying, look, we'll trade in local currencies. The U.S., I think, is wrong on this. The U.S. is saying no to that. They still want the dollar. That's being pushed. I think that will come back to bite us in terms of our policy.
But the stablecoin would bypass all this, you're saying?
I think that it fixes the problems here. And I think that it's enough to placate decision makers out of D.C., until DC gets its act together and says, okay, we're reading the room. We need to kind of change tack on a global level. Yeah. And the Trump administration likes crypto. We know that.
Yeah.
So I think this is what needs to get pushed. And I'm pretty.
But the digital currency is expanding across Africa, right? You're seeing that.
It is. And it's USDT, right? It's not USDC. For people who kind of follow that. I mean, I was in Nigeria a few months ago, and dealing with money in Nigeria is one of the most mind-numbing things. I mean, the banks don't work; they're out of naira. The naira is always in flux. You can't operate in Nigeria if you don't have this much in naira carrying in your pocket. I mean, it's horrible. You go; they've got these little POS stations. So, when we go and you swipe a credit card at a restaurant, they have those that act as ATMs. So there's a guy with a little POS system. They'll have actually multiple of them for different types of cards, MasterCard, International, whatever. And then he swipes it like an ATM, and then they go in the back and they bring out a whole bunch of naira. I mean, it's crazy. You go and you look. You're seeing people using Bitcoin. You're seeing people using USDT across this as stopgaps because their financial systems are broken.
Could you talk a little bit? Okay, so it seems to me too that we're kind of going back to the 80s. Is it a Cold War, and how will it affect risk, you think, or will we go back to the same issues in the 80s?
So it's a good question. I don't think we will. I think that this is all new problems. We'll use the Cold War as a reference point for sure. The battlescape, if I call it that, using to kind of continue on the Cold War analogy, the battlescape is much different. It's cyber, it's financial. SWIFT is under pressure. And there's a lot more actors, right? So this globalization, this new world order, Fareed Zakaria calls it the rise of the rest. Ian Bremmer calls it the G0 world, but what it means is there are a lot more active players, and whereas the Cold War had states with less agency or less confidence in terms of how to do stuff. I don't want to say that they didn't have agency, because they did. Anybody who studies the Cold War well, particularly in Africa, knows. But the battlescape is different. And I don't think that we're as prepared in the United States as we probably should be.
And of course, the risks would increase in this case. It'd be harder. It's a harder problem, right?
So it's a risk to the United States. But again, if we're looking at a country like Kenya or Congo, they're going to say, well, why do we need to pick sides? We want everything. And because people are able to articulate themselves, states are able to articulate their interests better. There's a lot of opportunity here. Right. Yeah. There are some states, there are some countries, particularly in Asia, which have less choice. Right. So if you look at Japan, Taiwan, Korea, you talked about Malaysia. These countries are most frightened. Philippines, most frightened. They don't really have much choice. Africa's got lots. Middle East has lots.
Yeah, it's very
right.
Good
Europe has more choice than parts of East Asia.
So, how does BRICS, in your opinion, apply to all this?
So, this is I'll also kind of critique U.S. policy again, right? Similar to this emphasis on this infatuation with everybody using the dollar every time. BRICS is good, right? Fundamentally, we need to have these countries trade more with each other, because American interests prosper when countries are stable, when they're involved in the global economic order, when they want to do transactions, and there's a lot of opportunity left on the table if these countries are not engaging in trade and not finding policy harmonization. So it's good, and yeah, China's in the mix. But let them do it. Deal with China. Don't punish Brazil. Don't punish South Africa for wanting to receive the most affordable products so that they can build what they need to build. The U.S. is not in a position to provide African countries the resources that they need to build cities, right? And if we think about what we need in Africa is to level up, there has to be more intentional urbanization. I mean, we're not going to provide them affordable concrete or tiles or machinery or all these things. But there are certain wins that we can get there. So what are we doing? Punishing these countries, and not giving them any solution, right? So if we were to say, okay, well, we're gonna heavily subsidize all these products, and we're gonna make it a better deal for you, they would trade with the U.S., but we're not doing that. We're just yelling at them.
But I mean, isn't that where the whole idea of DFC and the finance and this issue of stablecoin, would this be a way to allow them to achieve their goals and trade in local currency, but it would still have the underpinning of the U.S. dollar?
Yeah. So those are good moves that we need to be doing. It still does not fix the fundamental need for emerging markets to grow.
Oh, really?
And to grow affordably, right? I mean, so just kind of brick and mortar stuff. It's important for the U.S. and as long as we recognize that those policy decisions that we make are having a disproportionate impact on these markets, then we'll be able to calibrate that really well and defuse some of these problems that we're seeing.
Yeah, one thing you were saying though, where countries like Kenya and other countries are in the middle and they really want the best of both geopolitical powers, and they can choose and they might actually benefit from all this.
Yep.
But at the same time, I think back in the 80s, there were consequences to those decisions that were so terrible, like conflicts, funded opposition forces, and other crazy things, intelligence things that were going on.
Sure.
And we haven't really seen those geopolitical wars, those proxy wars.
Sure.
It was quite bad, if you recall, back in the 80s. I was involved in some of that stuff. And boy, I think there will be consequences for some of these countries, I would suspect, right?
Yeah. I mean, so we are seeing I agree with you fundamentally, right? But we are seeing this proxy thing play out, right? We're seeing this play out in Sudan.
Okay.
Right. We're seeing this play out in the Horn of Africa and the control of the Red Sea corridor, not to the extent as Angola and Congo and all that other and all these other countries. I think, and Russia, of course, is running proxies, right, with
Correct.
the Africa Corps
Correct.
and all that. And Russia is stoking insecurity in the Sahel. Russia's policy to Africa is very simple. Let's just sabotage things, because the more disorder, the more it looks like the U.S.-led world order is disintegrating, and this works for us. That's actually all they're doing in Africa. So we do have some proxy stuff going on, but I agree. It goes back to the comment I had earlier. The battlescape this time is different. It's cyber, it's financial, it's trade. And it's hard to, we wanted global trade, right? With the,
Yes.
the flat Earth, all this. This was something that we were stoking, and we said, and I do agree with us that if done right, it's the rise of the rest. You can't put the genie back in the bottle,
Right.
and we have states in Africa with the capital and the demand and the policy framework, so that they can build cities for the next billion, and there's no way to decouple China from emerging market growth. It's just not there.
So how does this all go back to risk advisory, the service?
So yeah, exactly. Good question. It goes down to, if you have investors who are looking in Africa, having them understand the direction of travel and giving them the kind of risk awareness, that advice, partnership development. That's how you cut through all of this big geopolitical stuff, and then find the opportunity, and then make the return, from that investment. It's essentially that's in its most distilled form. That's what it's saying.
Doesn't sound like that's changed, huh?
No, I don't think it will. The context will always change, but the approach fundamentally will remain the same.
Well, Declan, thank you. This was Exigent Risk Advisory Service, and I would encourage you to contact Declan if there's anything that you need here in Africa. This concludes Mission Ready, and we thank you today.